Section 7 of Chapter 23 of the History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by S.T. Macduff. Chapter 23, Section 7. That dexterous and eloquent statesman had two objects in view. One was to obtain for the state, as the price of a monopoly, a sum much larger than the old company was able to give. The other was to promote the interest of his own party. Nowhere was the conflict between Whigs and Tories sharper than in the City of London, and the influence of the City of London was felt to the remotest corner of the realm. To elevate the Whig section of that mighty commercial aristocracy which congregated under the arches of the Royal Exchange, and to depress the Tory section, had long been one of Montague's favourite schemes. He had already formed one citadel in the heart of that great emporium, and he now thought it might be in his power to erect and garrison a second stronghold in a position scarcely less commanding. It had often been said, in times of civil war, that whoever was master of the Tower and of Tilbury Fort was master of London. The fastnesses by means of which Montague proposed to keep the capital obedient in times of peace and of constitutional government were of a different kind. The Bank was one of his fortresses, and he trusted that a new India House would be the other. The task which he had undertaken was not an easy one, for while his opponents were united, his adherents were divided. Most of those who were for a new company thought that the new company ought, like the old company, to trade on a joint stock. But there were some who held that our commerce with India would be best carried on by means of what is called a regulated company. There was a Turkey company, the members of which contributed to a general fund, and had in return the exclusive privilege of trafficking with the Levant. But those members trafficked each on his own account. They forestalled each other, they undersold each other, one became rich, another became bankrupt. The corporation, meanwhile, watched over the common interest of all the members, furnished the crown with the means of maintaining an embassy at Constantinople, and placed several important port councils and vice-councils whose business was to keep the Pasha and the Cadi in good humour, and to arbitrate in disputes among Englishmen. Why might not the same system be found to answer in regions lying still further to the east? Why should not every member of the new company be at liberty to export European commodities to the countries beyond the Cape, and to bring back shawls, saltpetre, and bohea to England, while the company in its collective capacity might treat with Asiatic potentates, or exact reparation from them, and might be entrusted with powers for the administration of justice and for the government of forts and factories? Montague tried to please all those whose support was necessary to him, and this he could effect only by bringing forward a plan so intricate that it cannot without some pains be understood. He wanted 2 millions to extricate the state from its financial embarrassments. That sum he proposed to raise by a loan at 8%. The lenders might be either individuals or corporations, but they were all, individuals and corporations, to be united in a new corporation, which was to be called the General Society. Every member of the General Society, whether individual or corporation, might trade separately with India to an extent not exceeding the amount which such member had advanced to the government. But all the members, or any of them, might, if they so thought fit, give up the privilege of trading separately and unite themselves under a royal charter for the purpose of trading in common. Thus the General Society was, by its original constitution, a regulated company. But it was provided that either the whole society or any part of it might become a joint stock company. The opposition to the scheme was vehement and pertinacious. The old company presented petition after petition. The Tories, with Seymour at their head, appealed both to the good faith and to the compassion of Parliament. Much was said about the sanctity of the existing charter, and much about the tenderness due to the numerous families which had, in reliance on that charter, invested their substance in India stock. On the other side, there was no want of plausible topics or of skill to use them. Was it not strange that those who talked so much about the charter should have altogether overlooked the very clause of the charter on which the whole question turned? That clause expressly reserved to the government power of revocation, after 3 years' notice, if the charter should not appear to be beneficial to the public. The charter had not been found beneficial to the public, The 3 years' notice should be given, and in the year 1701 the revocation would take effect. What could be fairer? If anybody was so weak as to imagine that the privileges of the old company were perpetual, when the very instrument which created those privileges expressly declared them to be terminable, what right had he to blame the Parliament, which was bound to do the best for the state, for not saving him, at the expense of the state, from the natural punishment of his own folly? It was evident that nothing was proposed inconsistent with strict justice. And what right had the old company to more than strict justice? These petitioners who implored the legislature to deal indulgently with them in their adversity, how had they used their boundless prosperity? Had not the India House recently been the very den of corruption, the tainted spot from which the plague had spread to the Court and the Council, to the House of Commons and the House of Lords? Were the disclosures of 1695 forgotten, the £80,000 of secret service money disbursed in 1 year, the enormous bribes, direct and indirect, Seymour's saltpetre contracts, Leeds' bags of golds? By the malpractices which the inquiry in the Exchequer Chamber then brought to light, the charter had been forfeited, and it would have been well if the forfeiture had been immediately enforced. Had not time then pressed, said Montague, had it not been necessary that the session should close, it is probable that the petitioners, who now cry out that they cannot get justice, would have got more justice than they desired. If they had been called to account for great and real wrong in 1695, we should not have had them here complaining of imaginary wrong in 1698. The fight was protracted by the obstinacy and dexterity of the old company and its friends from the first week of May to the last week in June. It seems that many, even of Montague's followers, doubted whether the promised 2 millions would be forthcoming. His enemies confidently predicted that the General Society would be as complete a failure as the Land Bank had been in the year before the last, and that he would in the autumn find himself in charge of an empty exchequer. His activity and eloquence, however, prevailed. On the 26th of June, after many laborious sittings, the question was put that this bill do pass, and was carried by 115 votes to 78. In the Upper House the conflict was short and sharp. Some peers declared that, in their opinion, the subscription to the proposed loan, far from amounting to the 2 millions which the Chancellor of the Exchequer expected, would fall far short of 1 million. Others, with much reason, complained that a law of such grave importance should have been sent up to them in such a shape that they must either take the whole or throw out the whole. The privilege of the Commons with respect to money bills had of late been grossly abused. The Bank had been created by one money bill. This General Society was to be created by another money bill. Such a bill the Lords could not amend. They might indeed reject it, but to reject it was to shake the foundations of public credit and to leave the kingdom defenceless. Thus one branch of the legislature was systematically put under duress by the other, and seemed likely to be reduced to utter insignificance. It was better that the government should be once pinched for money than that the House of Peers should cease to be a part of the constitution. So strong was this feeling that the bill was carried only by 65 to 48. It received the royal sanction on the 5th of July. The King then spoke from the throne. This was the first occasion on which a King of England had spoken to a Parliament of which the existence was about to be terminated, not by his own act, but by the act of the law. He could not, he said, take leave of the lords and gentlemen before him without publicly acknowledging the great things which they had done for his dignity and for the welfare of the nation. He recounted the chief services which they had, during 3 eventful sessions, rendered to the country. These things will, he said, give a lasting reputation to this Parliament, and will be a subject of emulation to Parliaments which shall come after. The Houses were then prorogued. During the week which followed there was some anxiety as to the result of the subscription for the stock of the General Society. If that subscription failed, there would be a deficit, public credit would be shaken, and Montague would be regarded as a pretender who had owed his reputation to a mere run of good luck, and who had tempted chance once too often. But the event was such as even his sanguine spirit had scarcely ventured to anticipate. At 1 in the afternoon of the 14th of July, the books were opened at the hall of the Company of Mercers in Cheapside. An immense crowd was already collected in the street. As soon as the doors were flung wide, wealthy citizens with their money in their hands pressed in, pushing and elbowing each other. The guineas were paid down faster than the clerks could count them. Before night, £600,000 had been subscribed. The next day the throng was as great. More than one capitalist put down his name for £30,000. To the astonishment of those ill-boding politicians who were constantly repeating that the war, the debt, the taxes, the grants to Dutch courtiers had ruined the kingdom, the sum, which it had been doubted whether England would be able to raise in many weeks, was subscribed by London in a few hours. The applications from the provincial towns and rural districts came too late. The merchants of Bristol had intended to take £300,000 of the stock, but had waited to learn how the subscription went on before they gave their final orders, and by the time that the mail had gone down to Bristol and returned, there was no more stock to be had. This was the moment at which the fortunes of Montague reached the meridian. The decline was close at hand. His ability and his constant success were everywhere talked of with admiration and envy. That man, it was commonly said, has never wanted and never will want an expedient. During the long and busy session which had just closed, some interesting and important events had taken place which may properly be mentioned here. One of those events was the destruction of the most celebrated palace in which the sovereigns of England have ever dwelt. On the evening of the 4th of January, a woman, the patriotic journalists and pamphleteers of that time did not fail to note that she was a Dutch woman, who was employed as a laundress at Whitehall, lighted a charcoal fire in her room and placed some linen round it. The linen caught fire and burned furiously. The tapestry, the bedding, the wainscots were soon in a blaze. The unhappy woman who had done the mischief perished. Soon the flames burst out of the windows. All Westminster, all the Strand, all the river were in commotion. Before midnight the King's apartments, the Queen's apartments, the wardrobe, the Treasury, the office of the Privy Council, the office of the Secretary of State, had been destroyed. The two chapels perished together. That ancient chapel where Wolsey had heard mass in the midst of gorgeous copes, golden candlesticks, and jewelled crosses, and that modern edifice which had been erected for the devotions of James, and had been embellished by the pencil of Verrio and the chisel of Gibbons. Meanwhile, a great extent of building had been blown up, and it was hoped that by this expedient a stop had been put to the conflagration. But early in the morning a new fire broke out of the heaps of combustible matter which the gunpowder had scattered to right and left. The guardroom was consumed. No trace was left of that celebrated gallery which had witnessed so many balls and pageants, in which so many maids of honour had listened too easily to the vows and flatteries of gallants, and in which so many bags of gold had changed masters at the hazard table. During some time men despaired of the banqueting house. The flames broke in on the south of that beautiful hall, and were with great difficulty extinguished by the exertions of the guards, to whom Cutts, mindful of his honourable nickname of the Salamander, set as good an example on this night of terror as he had set in the breach of Namur. Many lives were lost, and many grievous wounds were inflicted by the falling masses of stone and timber before the fire was effectually subdued. When day broke, the heaps of smoking ruins spread from Scotland Yard to the Bowling Green, where the mansion of the Duke of Buccleuch now stands. The banqueting house was safe, but the graceful columns and festoons designed by Inigo were so much defaced and blackened that their form could hardly be discerned. There had been time to move the most valuable effects which were movable. Unfortunately, some of Holbein's finest pictures were painted on the walls, and are consequently known to us only by copies and engravings. The books of the Treasury and of the Privy Council were rescued, and are still preserved. The ministers whose offices had been burned down were provided with new offices in the neighbourhood. Henry VIII had built, close to St. James's Park, two appendages to the Palace of Whitehall, a cockpit and a tennis court. The Treasury now occupies the site of the cockpit, the Privy Council office the site of the tennis court. Notwithstanding the many associations which make the name of Whitehall still interesting to an Englishman, the old building was little regretted. It was spacious indeed and commodious, but mean and inelegant. The people of the capital had been annoyed by the scoffing way in which foreigners spoke of the principal residence of our sovereigns, and often said that it was a pity that the Great Fire had not spared the old portico of St. Paul's and the stately arcades of Gresham's Bourse, and taken in exchange that ugly old labyrinth of dingy brick and plastered timber. It might now be hoped that we should have a Louvre. Before the ashes of the old palace were cold, plans for a new palace were circulated and discussed. But William, who could not draw his breath in the air of Westminster, was little disposed to expend £1,000,000 on a house which it would have been impossible for him to inhabit. Many blamed him for not restoring the dwelling of his predecessors, and a few Jacobites, whose evil temper and repeated disappointments had driven almost mad, accused him of having burned it down. It was not till long after his death that Tory writers ceased to call for the rebuilding of Whitehall, and to complain that the King of England had no better town house than St. James, while the delightful spot where the Tudors and the Stuarts had held their councils and their revels was covered with the mansions of his jobbing courtiers. In the same week in which Whitehall perished, the Londoners were supplied with a new topic of conversation by a royal visit, which of all royal visits was the least pompous and ceremonious, and yet the most interesting and important. On the 10th of January, a vessel from Holland anchored off Greenwich, and was welcomed with great respect. Peter I, Tsar of Muscovy, was on board. He took boat with a few attendants, and was rowed up the Thames to Norfolk Street, where a house overlooking the river had been prepared for his reception. His journey is an epoch in the history not only of his own country, but of ours and of the world. To the polished nations of Western Europe, the empire which he governed had till then been what Bokhara or Siam is to us. That empire, indeed, though less extensive than at present, was the most extensive that had ever obeyed a single chief. The dominions of Alexander and of Trajan were small when compared with the immense area of the Scythian desert. But in the estimation of statesmen, that boundless expanse of larch forest and morass, where the snow lay deep during 8 months of every year, and where a wretched peasantry could with difficulty defend their hovels against troops of famished wolves, was of less account than the 2 or 3 square miles into which were crowded the counting houses, the warehouses, and the innumerable masts of Amsterdam. On the Baltic, Russia had not then a single port. Her maritime trade with the other nations of Christendom was entirely carried on at Archangel, a place which had been created and was supported by adventurers from our island. In the days of the Tudors, a ship from England, seeking a northeast passage to the land of silk and spice, had discovered the White Sea. The barbarians who dwelled on the shores of that dreary gulf had never before seen such a portent as a vessel of 160 tons burden. They fled in terror, and when they were pursued and overtaken, prostrated themselves before the chief of the strangers and kissed his feet. He succeeded in opening a friendly communication with them, and from that time there had been a regular commercial intercourse between our country and the subjects of the Tsar. A Russia company was incorporated in London. An English factory was built at Archangel. That factory was indeed, even in the latter part of the 17th century, a rude and mean building. The walls consisted of trees laid one upon another, and the roof was of birch bark. This shelter, however, was sufficient in the long summer day of the Arctic regions. Regularly at that season several English ships cast anchor in the bay. A fair was held on the beach. Traders came from a distance of many hundreds of miles to the only mart where they could exchange hemp and tar, hides and tallow, wax and honey, the fur of the sable and the wolverine, and the roe of the sturgeon of the Volga, for Manchester stuffs, Sheffield knives, Birmingham buttons, sugar from Jamaica, and pepper from Malabar. The commerce in these articles was open, but there was a secret traffic which was not less active or less lucrative, though the Russian laws had made it punishable, and though the Russian divines pronounced it damnable. In general, the mandates of princes and the lessons of priests were received by the Muscovite with profound reverence, but the authority of his princes and of his priests, united, could not keep him from tobacco. Pipes he could not obtain, but a cow's horn, perforated, served his turn. From every Archangel fair, rolls of the best Virginia speedily found their way to Novgorod and Tobolsk. End of Section 7, Chapter 23 of the History of England. Reading by S.T. Macduff.
Of Chapter 23 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bill McGovern. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 23, Section 8. The commercial intercourse between England and Russia made some diplomatic intercourse necessary. The diplomatic intercourse, however, was only occasional. The Tsar had no permanent minister here. We had no permanent minister in Moscow, and even at Archangel we had no consul. 3 or 4 times in a century, extraordinary embassies were sent from Whitehall to the Kremlin, and from the Kremlin to Whitehall. The English embassies had historians whose narratives may still be read with interest. Those historians described vividly and sometimes bitterly the savage ignorance and the squalid poverty of the barbarous country in which they had sojourned. In that country, they said, there was neither literature nor science, neither school nor college. It was not till more than 100 years after the invention of printing that a single printing press had been introduced into the Russian Empire, and that printing press had speedily perished in a fire which was supposed to have been kindled by the priests. Even in the 17th century, the library of a prelate of the first dignity consisted of a few manuscripts. Those manuscripts, too, were in long rolls, for the art of bookbinding was unknown. The best educated men could barely read and write. It was much if the secretary to whom was entrusted the direction of negotiations with foreign powers had a sufficient smattering of dog Latin to make himself understood. The arithmetic was the arithmetic of the Dark Ages. The denary notation was unknown. Even in the imperial treasury the computations were made by the help of balls strung on wires. Round the person of the sovereign there was a blaze of gold and jewels, but even in the most splendid palaces were to be found the filth and misery of an Irish cabin. So late as the year 1663, the gentlemen of the retinue of the Earl of Carlisle were, in the city of Moscow, thrust into a single bedroom, and were told that, if they did not remain together, they would be in danger of being devoured by rats. Such was the report which the English legations made of what they had seen and suffered in Russia, and their evidence was confirmed by the appearance which the Russian legations made in England. The strangers spoke no civilized language. Their garb, their gestures, their salutations had a wild and barbarous character. The ambassador and the grandees who accompanied him were so gorgeous that all London crowded to stare at them, and so filthy that nobody dared to touch them. They came to the court balls dropping pearls and vermin. It was said that one envoy cudgeled the lords of his train whenever they soiled or lost any part of their finery, and that another had with difficulty been prevented from putting his son to death for the crime of shaving and dressing after the French fashion. Our ancestors, therefore, were not a little surprised to learn that a young barbarian, who had at 17 years of age become the autocrat of the immense region, stretching from the confines of Sweden to those of China, and whose education had been inferior to that of an English farmer or shopman, had planned gigantic improvements, had learned enough of some languages of Western Europe to enable him to communicate with civilized men, had begun to surround himself with able adventurers from various parts of the world, had sent some of his many subjects to study languages, arts, and sciences in foreign cities, and finally had determined to travel as a private man and to discover by personal observation the secret of the immense prosperity and power enjoyed by some communities whose whole territory was far less than the 100th part of his dominions. It might have been expected that France would have been the first object of his curiosity, for the grace and dignity of the French king, the splendour of the French court, the discipline of the French armies, and the genius and learning of the French writers were then renowned all over the world. But the Tsar's mind had taken a strange ply, which it retained to the last. His empire was of all empires the least capable of being made a great naval power. The Swedish provinces lay between his states and the Baltic. The Bosporus and the Dardanelles lay between his states and the Mediterranean. He had access to the ocean only in a latitude in which navigation is, during a great part of every year, perilous and difficult. On the ocean he had only a single port, Archangel, and the whole shipping of Archangel was foreign. There did not exist a Russian vessel larger than a fishing boat. Yet, from some cause which cannot now be traced, he had a taste for maritime pursuits, which amounted to a passion, indeed almost to a monomania. His imagination was full of sails, yardarms, and rudders. That large mind, equal to the highest duties of the general and the statesman, contracted itself to the most minute details of naval architecture and naval discipline. The chief ambition of the great conqueror and legislator was to be a good boatswain and a good ship's carpenter. Holland and England therefore had for him an attraction which was wanting to the galleries and terraces of Versailles. He repaired to Amsterdam, took a lodging in the dockyard, assumed the garb of a pilot, put down his name on the list of workmen, wielded with his own hand the caulking iron and the mallet, fixed the pumps, and twisted the ropes. Ambassadors who came to pay their respects to him were forced, much against their will, to clamber up the rigging of a man of war, and found him enthroned on the cross trees. Such was the prince whom the populace of London now crowded to behold. His stately form, his intellectual forehead, his piercing black eyes, his Tartar nose and mouth, his gracious smile, his frown black with all the stormy rage and hate of a barbarian tyrant, and above all a strange nervous convulsion, which sometimes transformed his countenance during a few moments into an object on which it was impossible to look without terror. The immense quantities of meat which he devoured, the pints of brandy which he swallowed, and which, it was said, he had carefully distilled with his own hands, the fool who jabbered at his feet, the monkey which grinned at the back of his chair, were, during some weeks, popular topics of conversation. He meanwhile shunned the public gaze with a haughty shyness which inflamed curiosity. He went to a play, but as soon as he perceived that pit, boxes, and galleries were staring not at the stage but at him, he retired to a back bench, where he was screened from observation by his attendants. He was desirous to see a sitting of the House of Lords, but as he was determined not to be seen, he was forced to climb up to the leads and peep through a small window. He heard with great interest the royal assent given to a bill for raising £1,500,000 by land tax, and learned with amazement that this sum, although larger by one half than the whole revenue which he could wring from a population of the immense empire of which he was absolute master, was but a small part of what the Commons of England voluntarily granted each year to their constitutional king. William judiciously humoured the whims of his illustrious guest, and stole to Norfolk Street so quietly that nobody in the neighbourhood recognised His Majesty in the thin gentleman who got out of the modest-looking coach at the Tsar's lodging. The Tsar returned the visit with the same precautions, and was admitted into Kensington House by a back door. It was afterwards known that he took no notice of the fine pictures with which the palace was adorned, but over the chimney of the royal sitting-room was a plate which, by an ingenious machinery, indicated the direction of the wind, and with this plate he was in raptures. He soon became weary of his residence. He found that he was too far from the objects of his curiosity, and too near the crowds to which he was himself an object of curiosity. He accordingly removed to Deptford, and was there lodged in the house of John Evelyn, a house which had long been a favourite resort of men of letters, men of taste, and men of science. Here Peter gave himself up to his favourite pursuits. He navigated a yacht every day up and down the river. His apartment was crowded with models of 3-deckers and 2-deckers, frigates, sloops, and fireships. The only Englishman of rank in whose society he seemed to take much pleasure was the eccentric Caermarthen, whose passion for the sea bore some resemblance to his own, and who was very competent to give an opinion about every part of a ship, from the stem to the stern. Caermarthen, indeed, became so great a favourite that he prevailed on the Tsar to consent to the admission of a limited quantity of tobacco into Russia. There was reason to apprehend that the Russian clergy would cry out against any relaxation of the ancient rule, and would strenuously maintain that the practice of smoking was condemned by that text which declares that a man is defiled not by those things which enter in at the mouth, but by those which proceed out of it. This apprehension was expressed by a deputation of merchants who were admitted to an audience of the Tsar, but they were reassured by the air with which he told them that he knew how to keep priests in order. He was indeed so free from any bigoted attachment to the religion in which he had been brought up, that both Papists and Protestants hoped at different times to make him a proselyte. Burnet, commissioned by his brethren, and impelled, no doubt, by his own restless curiosity and love of meddling, repaired to Deptford, and was honoured with several audiences. The Tsar could not be persuaded to exhibit himself at St. Paul's, but he was induced to visit Lambeth Palace. There he saw the ceremony of ordination performed, and expressed warm approbation of the Anglican ritual. Nothing in England astonished him so much as the Archiepiscopal library. It was the first good collection of books that he had seen, and he declared that he had never imagined that there were so many printed volumes in the world. The impression which he made on Burnet was not favourable. The good bishop could not understand that a mind which seemed to be chiefly occupied with questions about the best place for a capstan and the best way of rigging a jury mast might be capable not merely of ruling an empire, but of creating a nation. He complained that he had gone to see a great prince and found only an industrious shipwright. Nor does Evelyn seem to have formed a much more favourable opinion of his august tenant. It was, indeed, not in the character of tenant that the Tsar was likely to gain the good word of civilized men. With all the high qualities which were peculiar to himself, he had all the filthy habits which were then common among his countrymen. To the end of his life, while disciplining armies, founding schools, framing codes, organizing tribunals, building cities and deserts, joining distant seas by artificial rivers, he lived in his palace like a hog in a sty, and, when he was entertained by other sovereigns, never failed to leave on their tapestried walls and velvet state beds unequivocal proof that a savage had been there. Evelyn's house was left in such a state that the Treasury quieted his complaints with a considerable sum of money. Toward the close of March, the Tsar visited Portsmouth, saw a sham sea fight at Spithead, watched every movement of the contending fleets with intense interest, and expressed in warm terms his gratitude to the hospitable government which had provided so delightful a spectacle for his amusement and instruction. After passing more than 3 months in England, he departed in high good humour. His visit, his singular character, and what was rumoured of his great designs, excited much curiosity here, but nothing more than curiosity. England had as yet nothing to hope or to fear from his vast empire. All her serious apprehensions were directed towards a different quarter. No one could say how soon France, so lately an enemy, might be an enemy again. The new diplomatic relations between the two great Western powers were widely different from those which had existed before the war. During the 18 years which had elapsed between the signing of the Treaty of Dover and the Revolution, all the envoys who had been sent from Whitehall to Versailles had been mere sycophants of the great King. In England the French ambassador had been the object of a degrading worship. The chiefs of both the great parties had been his pensioners and his tools. The ministers of the crown had paid him open homage. The leaders of the opposition had stolen into his house by the back door. Kings had stooped to implore his good offices, and had persecuted him for money with the importunity of street beggars. And when they had succeeded in obtaining from him a box of doubloons or a bill of exchange, had embraced him with tears of gratitude and joy. But those days were past. England would never again send a Preston or a Skelton to bow down before the majesty of France. France would never again send a Barillon to dictate to the cabinet of England. Henceforth the intercourse between the two states would be on terms of perfect equality. William thought it necessary that the minister who was to represent him at the French court should be a man of the first consideration, and one on whom entire reliance could be reposed. Portland was chosen for this important and delicate mission, and the choice was eminently judicious. He had, in the negotiations of the preceding year, shown more ability than was to be found in the whole crowd of formalists who had been exchanging notes and drawing up protocols at Ryswick. Things which had been kept secret from the plenipotentiaries who had signed the treaty were well known to him. The clue of the whole foreign policy of England and Holland was in his possession. His fidelity and diligence were beyond all praise. These were strong recommendations. Yet it seems strange to many that William should have been willing to part for a considerable time from a companion with whom he had, during a quarter of a century, lived on terms of entire confidence and affection. The truth was that the confidence was still what it had long been, but that the affection, though it was not yet extinct, though it had not even cooled, had become a cause of uneasiness to both parties. Till very recently, the little knot of personal friends who had followed William from his native land to his place of splendid banishment had been firmly united. The aversion which the English nation felt for them had given him much pain, but he had not been annoyed by any quarrel among themselves. Zulestein and Auverquerque had, without a murmur, yielded to Portland the first place in the royal favour, nor had Portland grudged to Zulestein and Auverquerque very solid and very signal proofs of their master's kindness. But a younger rival had lately obtained an influence which created much jealousy. Among the Dutch gentlemen who had sailed with the Prince of Orange from Helvoetsluys to Torbay was one named Arnold Van Keppel. Keppel had a sweet and obliging temper, winning manners, and a quick, though not profound, understanding. Courage, loyalty, and secrecy were common between him and Portland. In other points they differed widely. Portland was naturally the very opposite of a flatterer, and having been the intimate friend of the Prince of Orange at a time when the interval between the House of Orange and the House of Bentinck was not so wide as it afterwards became, had acquired a habit of plain speaking which he could not unlearn when the comrade of his youth had become the sovereign of 3 kingdoms. He was a most trusty, but not a very respectful subject. There was nothing which he was not ready to do or suffer from William. In his intercourse with William he was blunt and sometimes surly. Keppel, on the other hand, had a great desire to please, and looked up with unfeigned admiration to a master whom he had been accustomed, ever since he could remember, to consider as the first of living men. Arts, therefore, which were neglected by the elder courtier, were assiduously practised by the younger. So early as the spring of 1691, shrewd observers were struck by the manner in which Keppel watched every turn of the King's eye, and anticipated the King's unuttered wishes. Gradually the new servant rose into favour. he was at length made Earl of Albemarle and Master of the Robes. But his elevation, though it furnished the Jacobites with a fresh topic for calumny and ribaldry, was not so offensive to the nation as the elevation of Portland had been. Portland's manners were thought dry and haughty, but envy was disarmed by the blandness of Albemarle's temper and by the affability of his deportment. Portland, though strictly honest, was covetous. Albemarle was generous. Portland had been naturalized here only in name and form, but Albemarle affected to have forgotten his own country, and to have become an Englishman in feelings and manners. The palace was soon disturbed by quarrels, in which Portland seems to have always been the aggressor, and in which he found little support either among the English or among his own countrymen. William, indeed, was not the man to discard an old friend for a new one. He steadily gave, on all occasions, the preference to the companion of his youthful days. Portland had the first place in the bedchamber. He held high command in the army. On all great occasions he was trusted and consulted. He was far more powerful in Scotland than the Lord High Commissioner, and far deeper in the secret of foreign affairs than the Secretary of State. He wore the garter which sovereign princes coveted. Lands and money had been bestowed on him so liberally that he was one of the richest subjects in Europe. Albemarle had as yet not even a regiment. He had not been sworn of the council, and the wealth which he owed to the royal bounty was a pittance when compared with the domains and hoards of Portland. Yet Portland thought himself aggrieved. He could not bear to see any other person near him, though below him, in the royal favour. In his fits of resentful sullenness, he hinted an intention of retiring from the court. William omitted nothing that a brother could have done to soothe and conciliate a brother. Letters are still extant in which he, with the utmost solemnity, calls God to witness that his affection for Bentinck still is what it was in their earlier days. At length a compromise was made. Portland, disgusted with Kensington, was not sorry to go to France as ambassador, and William, with deep emotion, consented to a separation longer than had ever taken place during an intimacy of 25 years. A day or two after the new plenipotentiary had set out on his mission, he received a touching letter from his master. "The loss of your society," the King wrote, "has affected me more than you can imagine. I should be very glad if I could believe that you felt as much pain at quitting me as I felt at seeing you depart, for then I might hope that you had ceased to doubt the truth of what I so solemnly declared to you on my oath. Assure yourself that I never was more sincere. My feeling towards you is one which nothing but death can alter." It should seem that the answer returned to these affectionate assurances was not perfectly gracious, for, when the King next wrote, he gently complained of an expression which had wounded him severely. End of section 8. Recording by Bill McGovern.
Of Chapter 23 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Richard Carpenter. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 23, Section 9. But though Portland was an unreasonable and querulous friend, he was a most faithful and zealous minister. His dispatches show how indefatigably he toiled for the interest and how punctiliously he guarded the dignity of the prince by whom he imagined that he had been unjustly and unkindly treated. The embassy was the most magnificent that England had ever sent to a foreign court. 12 men of honourable birth and ample fortune, some of whom afterwards filled high offices in the state, attended the mission at their own charge. Each of them had his own carriage, his own horses, and his own train of servants. 2 less wealthy persons, who in different ways attained great note in literature, were of the company. Rapin, whose History of England might have been found a century ago in every library, was the preceptor of the ambassador's eldest son, Lord Woodstock. Prior was the secretary of the legation. His quick parts, his industry, his politeness, and his perfect knowledge of the French language marked him out as eminently fitted for diplomatic employment. He had, however, found much difficulty in overcoming an odd prejudice which his chief had conceived against him. Portland, with good natural abilities and great expertness in business, was no scholar. He had probably never read an English book, but he had a general notion, unhappily but too well founded, that the wits and poets who congregated at Will's were a most profane and licentious set, and being himself a man of orthodox opinions and regular life, he was not disposed to give his confidence to whom he supposed to be a ribald scoffer. Prior, with much address, and perhaps with the help of a little hypocrisy, completely removed this unfavorable impression. He talked on serious subjects seriously, quoted the New Testament appositely, vindicated Hammond on the charge of popery, and, by way of a decisive blow, gave the definition of a true church from the 19th article. Portland stared at him. "I am glad, Mr. Prior, to find you so good a Christian. I was afraid that you were an atheist." "An atheist, my good lord," cried Prior. "What could lead your lordship to entertain such a suspicion?" "Why," said Portland, "I knew that you were a poet, and I took for granted that you did not believe in God." "My lord," said the wit, "you do us poets the greatest injustice. Of all people, we are the farthest from atheism. For atheists do not even worship the true God, whom the rest of mankind acknowledge, and we are always invoking and hymning false gods whom everybody else has renounced." This jest will be perfectly intelligible to all who remember the eternally recurring allusions to Venus and Minerva, Mars, Cupid and Apollo, which were meant to be the ornaments and are the blemishers of Prior's compositions. But Portland was much puzzled. However, he declared himself satisfied, and the young diplomatist withdrew, laughing to think how little learning a man might shine in courts, lead armies, negotiate treaties, obtain a coronet and a garter, and leave a fortune of $500,000. The citizens of Paris and the courtiers of Versailles, though more accustomed than the Londoners to the magnificent pageantry, allowed that no minister from any foreign state had ever made so superb an appearance as Portland. His horses, his liveries, his plate were unrivalled. His state carriage, drawn by 8 fine Neapolitan greys, decorated with orange ribbons, was especially admired. On the day of his public entry, the streets, the balconies, and the windows were crowded with spectators along a line of 3 miles. As he passed over the bridge on which the statuary of Henry IV stands, he was much amused by hearing one of the crowd exclaim, "Was it not this gentleman's master that we burned on this very bridge 8 years ago?" The ambassador's hotel was constantly thronged from morning to night by visitors in plumes and embroidery. Several tables were sumptuously spread every day under his roof, and every English traveller of decent station and character was welcome to dine there. The board at which the master of the house presided in person, and at which he entertained his most distinguished guests, was said to be more luxurious than that of any prince of the house of Bourbon. For the most exquisite cookery of France was set off by a certain neatness and comfort which then, as now, peculiarly belonged to England. During the banquet, the room was filled with people of fashion, who went to see the grandees eat and drink. The expense of all this splendor and hospitality was enormous, and was exaggerated by report. The cost to the English government really was £50,000 in 5 months. It is probable that the opulent gentlemen who accompanied the mission as volunteers laid out nearly as much more from their private resources. The malcontents of the coffee houses of London murmured at this profusion, and accused William of ostentation. But as this fault was never on any other occasion imputed to him, even by his detractors, we may not unreasonably attribute to policy what to superficial or malicious observers seemed to be vanity. He probably thought it important, at the commencement of a new era in the relations between the two great kingdoms of the West, to hold high the dignity of the crown which he wore. He well knew, indeed, that the greatness of a prince does not depend on piles of silver bowls and chargers, trains of gilded coaches, and multitudes of running footmen in brocade, and led horses in velvet housings. But he knew also that the subjects of Lewis had, during the long reign of their magnificent sovereign, been accustomed to see power constantly associated with pomp, and would hardly believe that the substance existed unless they were dazzled by the trappings. If the object of William was to strike the imagination of the French people, he completely succeeded. The stately and gorgeous appearance which the English embassy made on public occasions was during some time the general topic of conversation at Paris. Portland enjoyed a popularity which contrasts strangely with the extreme unpopularity which he had incurred in England. The contrast will perhaps seem less strange when we consider what immense sums he had accumulated at the expense of the English, and what immense sums he was laying out for the benefit of the French. It must also be remembered that he could not confer or correspond with Englishmen in their own language, and that the French tongue was at least as familiar to him as that of his native Holland. He therefore, who was called greedy, niggardly, dull, brutal, whom one Englishman had described as a block of wood, and another as just capable of carrying a message right, was in the brilliant circles of France considered as a model of grace, of dignity, and of munificence, as a dexterous negotiator and a finished gentleman. He was the better liked because he was a Dutchman. For though fortune had favoured William, though considerations of policy had induced the court of Versailles to acknowledge him, he was still, in the estimation of that court, an usurper, and his English counsellors and captains were perjured traitors who richly deserved axes and halters, and might perhaps get what they deserved. But Bentinck was not to be confounded with Leeds and Marlborough, Orford and Godolphin. He had broken no oath, had violated no law. He owed no allegiance to the house of Stuart, and the fidelity and zeal with which he had discharged his duties to his own country and his own master entitled him to respect. The noble and powerful vied with each other in paying honour to the stranger. The ambassador was splendidly entertained by the Duke of Orleans at St. Cloud, and by the Dauphin at Meudon. A marshal of France was charged to do the honours at Merli, and Lewis graciously expressed his concern that the frost of an ungenial spring prevented the fountains and flower beds from appearing to advantage. On one occasion Portland was distinguished, not only by being selected to hold the wax light in the royal bedroom, but by being invited to go within the balustrade which surrounded the couch, a magic circle which the most illustrious foreigners had hitherto found impassable. The secretary shared largely in the attentions which were paid to his chief. The Prince of Condé took pleasure in talking with him on literary subjects. The courtesy of the aged Bossuet, the glory of the Church of Rome, was long gratefully remembered by the young heretic. Boileau had good sense and good feeling to exchange a friendly greeting with the aspiring novice who had administered to him a discipline as severe as he had administered to Quinault. The great king himself warmly praised Prior's manners and conversation, a circumstance which will be thought remarkable when it is remembered that His Majesty was an excellent model and an excellent judge of gentlemanlike deportment, and that Prior had passed his boyhood in drawing corks at a tavern, and his early manhood in the seclusion of a college. The secretary did not, however, carry his politeness so far as to refrain from asserting, on proper occasions, the dignity of his country and of his master. He looked coldly on the 21 celebrated pictures in which Le Brun had represented on the coifing of the gallery of Versailles the exploits of Lewis. When he was sneeringly asked whether Kensington Palace could boast of such decorations, he answered with spirit and propriety, "No, sir, the memorials of the great things which my master has done are to be seen in many palaces, but not in his own house." Great as was the success of the embassy, there was one drawback. James was still at Saint-Germain, and round the mock king were gathered a mock court and council, a great seal and a privy seal, a crowd of garters and collars, white staves and gold keys. Against the pleasure which the marked attentions of the French princes and grandees gave to Portland was to be set off the vexation which he felt when Middleton crossed his path with the busy look of a real Secretary of State. But it was with emotions far deeper that the ambassador saw on the terraces and in the antechambers of Versailles men who had been deeply implicated in plots against the life of his master. He expressed his indignation loudly and vehemently. "I hope," he said, "that there is no design in this, that these wretches are not purposely thrust in my way. When they come near me, all my blood runs back in my veins." His words were reported to Lewis. Lewis employed Boufflers to smooth matters, and Boufflers took occasion to say something on the subject, as if from himself. Portland easily divined that in talking with Boufflers he was really talking with Lewis, and eagerly seized the opportunity of representing the expediency, the absolute necessity of removing James to a greater distance from England. "It was not contemplated, Marshal," he said, "when we arranged the terms of peace in Brabant, that a palace in the suburbs of Paris was to continue to be an asylum for outlaws and murderers." "Nay, my lord," said Boufflers, uneasy doubtless on his own account, "you will not, I am sure, assert that I gave you any pledge that King James would be required to leave France. You are too honourable a man, you are too much my friend, to say any such thing." "It is true," answered Portland, "that I did not insist on a positive promise from you. But remember what passed. I proposed that King James should retire to Rome or Modena. Then you suggested Avignon, and I assented. Certainly my regard for you makes me very unwilling to do anything that would give you pain. But my master's interests are dearer to me than all the friends that I have in the world put together. I must tell his most Christian Majesty all that has passed between us, and I hope that, when I tell him, you will be present, and that you will be able to bear witness that I have not put a single word of mine into your mouth." When Boufflers had argued and expostulated in vain, Villeroy was sent on the same errand, but had no better success. A few days later, Portland had a long private audience with Lewis. Lewis declared that he was determined to keep his word, to preserve the peace of Europe, to abstain from everything which could give just cause of offence to England, but that as a man of honour, as a man of humanity, he could not refuse shelter to an unfortunate king, his own first cousin. Portland replied that nobody questioned his Majesty's good faith, but that while Saint-Germain was occupied by its present inmates, it would be beyond even his Majesty's power to prevent eternal plotting between them and the malcontents on the other side of the Straits of Dover, and that while such plotting went on, the peace must necessarily be insecure. The question was really not one of humanity. It was not asked, it was not wished, that James should be left destitute. Nay, the English government was willing to allow him an income larger than that which he derived from the munificence of France. £50,000 a year, to which in the strictness of law he had no right, awaited his acceptance, if he would only move to a greater distance from the country which, while he was near it, could never be at rest. If in such circumstances he refused to move, this was the strongest reason for believing that he could not safely be suffered to stay. The fact that he thought the difference between residing at Saint-Germain and residing in Avignon worth more than 50,000 a year sufficiently proved that he had not relinquished the hope of being restored to his throne by means of a rebellion or of something worse. Lewis answered that on that point his resolution was unalterable. He never would compel his guest and his kinsman to depart. "There is another matter," said Portland, "about which I have felt it my duty to make representations. I mean the countenance given to the assassins. I know nothing about assassins, said Lewis. Of course, answered the ambassador, your majesty knows nothing about such men. At least your majesty does not know them for what they are. But I can point them out, and can furnish ample proofs of their guilt. He then named Berwick, for the English government, which had been willing to make large allowances for Berwick's peculiar position as long as he confined himself to acts of open and of manly hostility, conceived that he had forfeited all claims to indulgence by being privy to the assassination plot. This man, Portland said, constantly haunted Versailles. Barclay, whose guilt was a still deeper dye, Barclay, the chief contriver of the murderous ambuscade of Turnham Green, had found in France not only an asylum, but an honourable military position. The monk who was sometimes called Harrison, and sometimes went by the alias of Johnson, but whom, whether Harrison or Johnson, had been one of the earliest and one of the most bloodthirsty of Barclay's accomplices, was now comfortably settled as prior of a religious house in France. Lewis denied or evaded all these charges. I never, he said, heard of your Harrison. As to Barclay, he certainly once had a company, but it has been disbanded, and what has become of him I do not know. It is true that Berwick was in London towards the close of 1695, but he was there only for the purpose of ascertaining whether a descent on England was practicable, and I am confident that he was no party to any cruel or dishonourable design. In truth, Lewis had a strong personal motive for defending Berwick. The guilt of Berwick, as respected the assassination plot, does not appear to have extended beyond connivance, and to the extent of connivance Lewis himself was guilty. Thus the audience was terminated. All that was left to Portland was to announce that the exiles must make their choice between Saint-Germain and 50,000 a year, that the Protocol of Ryswick bound the English government to pay to Mary Modena only what the law gave her, that the law gave her nothing, that consequently the English government was bound to nothing, and that while she, her husband, and her child remained where they were, she would have nothing. It was hoped that this announcement would produce a considerable effect even in James' household, and indeed some of his hungry courtiers and priests seem to have thought the chance of a restoration so small that it would be absurd to refuse a splendid income, though coupled with a condition which might make that small chance somewhat smaller. But it is certain that, if there was murmuring among the Jacobites, it was disregarded by James. He was fully resolved not to move, and was only confirmed in his resolution by learning that he was regarded by the usurper as a dangerous neighbour. Lewis paid so much regard to Portland's complaints as to intimate to Middleton a request equivalent to a command, that the lords and gentlemen who formed the retinue of the banished King of England would not come to Versailles on days on which the representative of the actual king was expected there. But at other places there was constant risk of an encounter which might have produced several duels, if not a European war. James, indeed, far from shunning such encounters, seems to have taken a perverse pleasure in thwarting his benefactor's wish to keep the peace, and in placing the ambassador in embarrassing situations. One day his Excellency, while drawing on his boots for a run with the Dauphin's celebrated wolf pack, was informed that King James meant to be of the party, and was forced to stay at home. Another day, when his Excellency had set his heart on having some sport with the royal staghounds, he was informed by the grand huntsman that King James might probably come to the rendezvous without any notice. Melfort was particularly active in laying traps for the young noblemen and gentlemen of the legation. The Prince of Wales was more than once placed in such a situation that they could scarcely avoid passing close to him. Were they to salute him? Were they to stand erect and covered while everybody else saluted him? No Englishman, zealous for the Bill of Rights and the Protestant religion, would willingly do anything which could be construed into an act of homage to a popish pretender. Yet no good-natured and generous man, however firm in his Whig principles, would willingly offer anything which could look like an affront to an innocent and a most unfortunate child. End of section 9. Recording by Richard Carpenter in Seattle, Washington.
Section 10 of Chapter 23 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jen Raimundo. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 23, Section 10. Meanwhile, other matters of grave importance claimed Portland's attention. There was one matter in particular about which the French ministers anxiously expected him to say something, but about which he observed strict silence. How to interpret that silence they scarcely knew. They were certain only that it could not be the effect of unconcern. They were well assured that the subject which he so carefully avoided was never, during 2 waking hours together, out of his thoughts or out of the thoughts of his master. Nay, there was not in all Christendom a single politician, from the greatest ministers of state down to the silliest newsmongers of coffee-houses, who really felt that indifference which the prudent ambassador of England affected. A momentous event, which had during many years been constantly becoming more and more probable, was now certain and near. Charles II of Spain, the last descendant in the male line of the Emperor Charles V, would soon die without posterity. Who would then be the heir to his many kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, lordships, acquired in different ways, held by different titles, and subject to different laws? That was a question about which jurists differed, and which it was not likely that jurists would, even if they were unanimous, be suffered to decide. Among the claimants were the mightiest sovereigns of the continent. There was little chance that they would submit to any arbitration but that of the sword. And it could not be hoped that, if they appealed to the sword, other potentates who had no pretension to any part of the disputed inheritance would long remain neutral. For there was in Western Europe no government which did not feel that its own prosperity, dignity, and security might depend on the event of the contest. It is true that the empire, which had in the preceding century threatened both France and England with subjugation, had of late been of hardly so much account as the Duchy of Savoy or the Electorate of Brandenburg. But it by no means followed that the fate of that empire was matter of indifference to the rest of the world. The paralytic helplessness and drowsiness of the body once so formidable could not be imputed to any deficiency of the natural elements of power. The dominions of the Catholic king were in extent and in population superior to those of Louis and of William united. Spain alone, without a single dependency, ought to have been a kingdom of the first rank, and Spain was but the nucleus of the Spanish monarchy. The outlying provinces of that monarchy in Europe would have sufficed to make 3 highly respectable states of the second order. One such state might have been formed in the Netherlands. It would have been a wide expanse of cornfield, orchard, and meadow, intersected by navigable rivers and canals. At short intervals, in that thickly peopled and carefully tilled region, rose stately old towns, encircled by strong fortifications, embellished by fine cathedrals and senate houses, and renowned either as seats of learning or as seats of mechanical industry. A second flourishing principality might have been created between the Alps and the Po, out of that well-watered garden of olives and mulberry trees which spreads many miles on every side of the great white temple of Milan. Yet neither the Netherlands nor the Milanese could, in physical advantages, vie with the kingdom of the 2 Sicilies, a land which nature had taken pleasure in enriching and adorning, a land which would have been paradise, if tyranny and superstition had not, during many ages, lavished all their noxious influences on the Bay of Campania, the plain of Enna, and the sunny banks of Galicis. In America, the Spanish territories spread from the equator northward and southward through all the signs of the zodiac far into the temperate zone. Thence came gold and silver to be coined in all the mints, and curiously wrought in all the jewellers' shops, of Europe and Asia. Thence came the finest tobacco, the finest chocolate, the finest indigo, the finest cochineal, the hides of innumerable wild oxen, quinquina, coffee, sugar. Either the viceroyalty of Mexico or the viceroyalty of Peru would, as an independent state with ports open to all the world, have been an important member of the great community of nations. And yet the aggregate, made up of so many parts, each of which separately might have been powerful and highly considered, was impotent to a degree which moved at once pity and laughter. Already one most remarkable experiment had been tried on this strange empire. A small fragment, hardly a 300th part of the whole in extent, hardly a 30th part of the whole in population, had been detached from the rest, had from that moment begun to display a new energy and to enjoy a new prosperity, and was now, after the lapse of 120 years, far more feared and reverenced than the huge mass of which it had once been an obscure corner. What a contrast between the Holland which Alba had oppressed and plundered, and the Holland from which William had sailed to deliver England! And who, with such an example before him, would venture to foretell what changes might be at hand if the most languid and torpid of monarchies should be dissolved, and if every one of the members which had composed it should enter on an independent existence? To such a dissolution that monarchy was peculiarly liable. The king, and the king alone, held it together. The populations which acknowledged him as their chief either knew nothing of each other or regarded each other with positive aversion. The Biscayan was in no sense the countryman of the Valencian, nor the Lombard of the Biscayan, nor the Fleeting of the Lombard, nor the Sicilian of the Fleeting. The Aragonese had never ceased to pine for their lost independence. Within the memory of many persons still living, the Catalans had risen in a rebellion, had entreated Louis XIII of France to become their ruler with the old title of Count of Barcelona, and had actually sworn fealty to him. Before the Catalans had been quieted, the Neapolitans had taken arms, had abjured their foreign master, had proclaimed their city a republic, and had elected a Loge. In the New World, the small caste of born Spaniards which had the exclusive enjoyment of power and dignity was hated by Creoles and Indians, mestizos and quadroons. The Mexicans especially had turned their eyes on a chief who bore the name and had inherited the blood of the unhappy Montezuma. Thus it seemed that the empire against which Elizabeth and Henry IV had been scarcely able to contend would not improbably fall to pieces of itself, and that the first violent shock from without would scatter the ill-cemented parts of the huge fabric in all directions. But, though such a dissolution had no terrors for the Catalonian or the Fleming, for the Lombard or the Calabrian, for the Mexican or the Peruvian, the thought of it was torture and madness to the Castilian. Castile enjoyed the supremacy in that great assemblage of races and languages. Castile sent out governors to Brussels, Milan, Naples, Mexico, Lima. To Castile came the annual galleons laden with treasures of America. In Castile was ostentatiously displayed and lavishly spent great fortunes made in remote provinces by oppression and corruption. In Castile were the king and his court. There stood the stately Escurial, once the centre of the politics of the world, the place to which distant potentates looked, some with hope and gratitude, some with dread and hatred, but none without anxiety and awe. The glory of the house had indeed departed. It was long since couriers bearing orders big with the fate of kings and commonwealths had ridden forth from those gloomy portals. Military renown, maritime ascendancy, the policy once reputed so profound, the wealth once deemed inexhaustible, had passed away. An undisciplined army, a rotting fleet, an incapable council, an empty treasury, were all that remained of that which had been so great. Yet the proudest of nations could not bear to part even with the name and the shadow of a supremacy which was no more. All, from the grandee of the first class to the peasant, looked forward with dread to the day when God should be pleased to take their king to himself. Some of them might have a predilection for Germany, but such predilections were subordinate to a stronger feeling. The paramount object was the integrity of the empire of which Castile was the head, and the prince who should appear to be most likely to preserve that integrity unviolated would have the best right to the allegiance of every true Castilian. No man of sense, however, out of Castile, when he considered the nature of the inheritance and the situation of the claimants, could doubt that a partition was inevitable. Among those claimants 3 stood preeminent, the Dauphin, the Emperor Leopold, and the Electoral Prince of Bavaria. If the question had been simply one of pedigree, the right of the Dauphin would have been incontestable. Louis XIV had married the Infanta Maria Theresa, eldest daughter of Philip IV and sister of Charles II. Her eldest son, the Dauphin, would therefore, in the regular course of things, have been her brother's successor. But she had, at the time of her marriage, renounced, for herself and her posterity, all pretensions to the Spanish crown. To that renunciation her husband had assented. It had been made an article of the Treaty of the Pyrenees. The Pope had been requested to give his apostolical sanction to an arrangement so important to the peace of Europe, and Louis had sworn, by everything that could bind a gentleman, a king, and a Christian, by his honour, by his royal word, by the canon of the Mass, by the Holy Gospels, by the cross of Christ, that he would hold the renunciation sacred. The claim of the Emperor was derived from his mother Marianne, daughter of Philip III, and aunt of Charles II, and could not therefore, if nearness of blood alone were to be regarded, come into competition with the claim of the Dauphin. But the claim of the Emperor was barred by no renunciation. The rival pretensions of the great houses of Bourbon and Habsburg furnished all Europe with an inexhaustible subject of discussion. Plausible topics were not wanting to the supporters of either cause. The partisans of the House of Austria dwelt on the sacredness of treaties, the partisans of France on the sacredness of birthright. How, it was asked on one side, can a Christian king have the effrontery, the impiety, to insist on a claim which he has with such solemnity renounced in the face of heaven and earth? How, it was asked on the other side, can the fundamental laws of a monarchy be annulled by any authority but that of the supreme legislator? The only body which was competent to take away from the children of Maria Theresa their hereditary rights were the Comes. The Comes had not ratified her renunciation. The renunciation was therefore a nullity, and no swearing, no signing, no sealing could turn that nullity into a reality. Which of these two mighty competitors had the better case may perhaps be doubted. What could not be doubted was that neither would obtain the prize without a struggle which would shake the world. Nor can we justly blame either for refusing to give way to the other. For on this occasion the chief motive which actuated them was not greediness, but the fear of degradation and ruin. Lewis, in resolving to put everything to hazard rather than suffer the power of the House of Austria to be doubled. Leopold, in determining to put everything to hazard rather than suffer the power of the House of Bourbon to be doubled, merely obeyed the law of self-preservation. There was therefore one way, and one alone, by which the great woe which seemed to be coming on Europe could be averted. Was it possible that the dispute might be compromised? Might not the two great rivals be induced to make a third-party concessions, such as neither could reasonably be expected to make to the other? The third party, to whom all who were anxious for the peace of Christendom looked as their best hope, was a child of tender age, Joseph, son of the Elector of Bavaria. His mother, the Electress Marie Antoinette, was the only child of the Emperor Leopold by his first wife Margaret, a younger sister of the Queen of Louis XIV. Prince Joseph was, therefore, nearer in blood to the Spanish throne than his grandfather the Emperor, or than the sons whom the Emperor had by his second wife. The Infanta Margaret had indeed at the time of her marriage renounced her rights to the kingdom of her forefathers. But the renunciation wanted many formalities which had been observed in her sister's case, and might be considered as cancelled by the will of Philip IV, which had declared that, failing his issue male, Margaret and her posterity would be entitled to inherit his crown. The partisans of France held that the Bavarian claim was better than the Austrian claim. The partisans of Austria held that the Bavarian claim was better than the French claim. But that which really constituted the strength of the Bavarian claim was the weakness of the Bavarian government. The electoral prince was the only candidate whose success would alarm nobody, would not make it necessary for any power to raise another regiment, to man another frigate, to have in store another barrel of gunpowder. He was therefore the favourite candidate of prudent and peaceful men in every country. Thus all Europe was divided into the French, the Austrian, and the Bavarian factions. The contests of these factions were daily renewed in every place where men congregated, from Stockholm to Malta, from Lisbon to Smyrna. But the fiercest and most obstinate conflict was that which raged in the palace of the Catholic king. Much depended on him, for, though it was not pretended that he was competent to alter by his sole authority the law which regulated the descent of the crown, yet, in a case in which the law was doubtful, it was probable that his subjects might be disposed to accept the construction which he might put upon it, and to support the claimant whom he might, either by a solemn adoption or by will, designate as the rightful heir. It was also in the power of the reigning sovereign to entrust all the most important offices in his kingdom, the government of all the provinces subject to him in the Old and the New World, and the keys of all his fortresses and arsenals, to persons zealous for the family which he was inclined to favour. It was difficult to say to what extent the fate of whole nations might be affected by the conduct of the officers who, at the time of his decease, might command the garrisons of Barcelona, of Mons, and of Namur. The prince on whom so much depended was the most miserable of human beings. In old times he would have been exposed as soon as he came into the world, and to expose him would have been a kindness. From his birth a blight was on his body and on his mind. With difficulty his almost imperceptible spark of life had been screened and fanned into a dim and flickering flame. His childhood, except when he could be rocked and sung into sickly sleep, was one long piteous wail. Until he was 10 years old, his days were passed on the laps of women, and he has never once suffered to stand on his rickety legs. None of those tawny little urchins, clad in rags stolen from scarecrows, whom Murillo loved to paint begging or rolling in the sand, owed less to education than this despotic ruler of 30 millions of subjects. The most important events in the history of his own kingdom, the very names of provinces and cities which were amongst his most valuable possessions, were unknown to him. It may well be doubted whether he was aware that Sicily was an island, that Christopher Columbus had discovered America, or that the English were not Mahometans. In his youth, however, though too imbecile for study or for business, he was not incapable of being amused. He shot, hawked, and hunted. He enjoyed with the delight of a true Spaniard two delightful spectacles, a horse with its bowels gored out, and a Jew writhing in the fire. The time came when the mightiest of instincts ordinarily wakens from its repose. It was hoped that the young king would not prove invincible to female attractions, and that he would leave a Prince of Asturias to succeed him. A consort was found for him in the royal family of France, and her beauty and grace gave him a languid pleasure. He liked to adorn her with jewels, to see her dance, and to tell her what sport he had had with his dogs and his falcons. But it was soon whispered that she was a wife only in name. She died, and her place was supplied by a German princess nearly allied to the imperial house. But the second marriage, like the first, proved barren, and long before the king had passed the prime of life, all the politicians of Europe had begun to take it for granted in all their calculations that he would be the last descendant in the male line of Charles V. Meanwhile, a sullen and abject melancholy took possession of his soul. The diversions which had been the serious employment of his youth became distasteful to him. He ceased to find pleasure in his nets and boar spears, in the fandango and the bullfight. Sometimes he shut himself up in an inner chamber from the eyes of his courtiers. Sometimes he loitered alone, from sunrise to sunset, in the dreary and rugged wilderness which surrounds the Escurial. The hours which he did not waste in listless indolence were divided between childish sports and childish devotions. He delighted in rare animals, and still more in dwarfs. When neither strange beasts nor little men could dispel the black thoughts which gathered in his mind, he repeated Aves and Credos. He walked in processions. Sometimes he starved himself, sometimes he whipped himself. At length the complication of maladies completed the ruin of all his faculties. His stomach failed, nor was this strange, for in him the malformation of the jaw, characteristic of his family, was so serious that he could not masticate his food, and he was in the habit of swallowing ollas and sweetmeats in the state in which they were set before him. While suffering from indigestion, he was attacked by ague. Every third day his convulsive tremblings, his dejection, his fits of wandering, seemed to indicate the approach of dissolution. His misery was increased by the knowledge that everybody was calculating how long he had to live, and wondering what would become of his kingdoms when he should be dead. The stately dignitaries of his household, the physicians who ministered to his deceased body, the divine whose business was to soothe his not less diseased mind, the very wife who should have been intent on those gentle offices by which female tenderness can alleviate even the misery of hopeless decay, were all thinking of the new world which was to commence with his death, and would have been perfectly willing to see him in the hands of the embalmer if they could have been certain that his successor would be the prince whose interests they espoused. As yet the party of the emperor seemed to predominate. Charles had a faint sort of preference for the House of Austria, which was his own house, and a faint sort of antipathy to the House of Bourbon, with which he had been quarrelling. He did not well know why, ever since he could remember. His queen, whom he did not love, but of whom he stood greatly in awe, was devoted to the interests of her kinsman the emperor, and with her was closely leagued the Count of Melgar, hereditary Admiral of Castile and Prime Minister. End of Section 10. Recording by Jen Raimundo. Section 11 of Chapter 23 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jen Raimundo. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 23, Section 11. Such was the state of the first question of the Spanish succession at the time when Portland had his first public audience at Versailles. The French ministers were certain that he must be constantly thinking about that question, and were therefore perplexed by his evident determination to say nothing about it. They watched his lips in the hope that he would at least let fall some unguarded word indicating the hopes or fears entertained by the English and Dutch governments. But Portland was not a man out of whom much was to be got in that way. Nature and habit cooperating had made him the best keeper of secrets in Europe. Louis therefore directed Pomponne and Torcy, two ministers of eminent ability, who had under himself the chief direction of foreign affairs, to introduce the subject which the discreet confidant of William seemed studiously to avoid. Pomponne and Torcy accordingly repaired to the English Embassy, and there opened one of the most remarkable negotiations recorded in the annals of European diplomacy. The two French statesmen professed in their master's name the most earnest desire, not only that the peace might remain unbroken, but that there might be a close union between the courts of Versailles and Kensington. One event only seemed likely to raise new troubles. If the Catholic king should die before it had been settled who should succeed to his immense dominions, there was but too much reason to fear that the nations, which were just beginning to breathe after an exhausting and devastating struggle of 9 years, would be again in arms. His most Christian Majesty was therefore desirous to employ the short interval which might remain in concerting with the King of England the means of preserving the tranquillity of the world. Portland made a courteous but guarded answer. He could not, he said, presume to say exactly what William's sentiments were, but this he knew, that it was not solely or chiefly by the sentiments of the King of England that the policy of England on a great occasion would be regulated. The islanders must and would have their government administered according to certain maxims which they held sacred, and of those maxims they held none more sacred than this, that every increase of the power of France ought to be viewed with extreme jealousy. Pomponne and Torcy answered that their master was most desirous to avoid everything which could excite the jealousy of which Portland had spoken. But was it of France alone that a nation so enlightened as the English must be jealous? Was it forgotten that the House of Austria had once aspired to universal dominion? And would it be wise in the princes and commonwealths of Europe to lend their aid for the purpose of reconstructing the gigantic monarchy which, in the 16th century, had seemed likely to overwhelm them all? Portland answered that, on this subject, he must be understood to express only the opinions of a private man. He had, however, now lived, during some years, among the English, and believed himself to be pretty well acquainted with their temper. They would not, he thought, be much alarmed by any augmentation of power which the Emperor might obtain. The sea was their element. Traffic by sea was the great source of their wealth, ascendancy on the sea the great object of their ambition. Of the Emperor they had no fear. Extensive as was the area which he governed, he had not a frigate on the water, and they cared nothing for his Pandours and Croatians. But France had a great navy. The balance of maritime power was what would be anxiously watched in London, and the balance of maritime power would not be affected by an union between Spain and Austria, but would be most seriously deranged by an union between Spain and France. Pomponne and Torcy declared that everything should be done to quiet the apprehensions which Portland had described. It was not contemplated, it was not wished, that France and Spain should be united. The Dauphin and his eldest son, the Duke of Burgundy, would waive their rights. The younger brothers of the Duke of Burgundy, Philip Duke of Anjou and Charles Duke of Berry, were not named, but Portland perfectly understood what was meant. There would, he said, be scarcely less alarm in England if the Spanish dominions devolved on a grandson of His Most Christian Majesty than if they were annexed to the French crown. The laudable affection of the young princes for their country and their family, and their profound respect for the great monarchy from whom they were descended, would inevitably determine their policy. The two kingdoms would be one, the two navies would be one, and all other states would be reduced to vassalage. England would rather see the Spanish monarchy added to the Emperor's dominions than governed by any one of the younger French princes, who would, though nominally independent, be really a viceroy of France. But in truth there was no risk that the Spanish monarchy would be added to the Emperor's dominions. He and his eldest son, the Archduke Joseph, would, no doubt, be as ready to waive their rights as the Dauphin and the Duke of Burgundy could be, and thus the Austrian claim to the disputed heritage would pass to the younger Archduke Charles. A long discussion followed. At length Portland plainly avowed, always merely as his own private opinion, what was the opinion of every intelligent man who wished to preserve the peace of the world. France is afraid, he said, of everything which can increase the power of the Emperor. All Europe is afraid of everything which can increase the power of France. Why not put an end to all these uneasy feelings at once by agreeing to place the Electoral Prince of Bavaria on the throne of Spain? To this suggestion no decisive answer was returned. The conference ended, and a courier started for England with a dispatch informing William of what had passed, and soliciting further instructions. William, who was, as he had always been, his own secretary for foreign affairs, did not think it necessary to discuss the contents of this dispatch with any of his English ministers. The only person whom he consulted was Heinsius. Portland received a kind letter warmly approving all that he had said in the conference, and directing him to declare that the English government sincerely wished to avert the calamities which were but too likely to follow the death of the King of Spain, and would therefore be prepared to take into serious consideration any definite plan which His Most Christian Majesty might think fit to suggest. "I will own to you," William wrote to his friend, "that I am so unwilling to be again at war during the short time which I still have to live, that I will omit nothing that I can honestly and with a safe conscience do for the purpose of maintaining peace." William's message was delivered by Portland to Lewis at a private audience. In a few days Pomponne and Torcy were authorised to propose a plan. They fully admitted that all neighbouring states were entitled to demand the strongest security against the union of the French and Spanish crowns. Such security should be given. The Spanish government might be requested to choose between the Duke of Anjou and the Duke of Berry. The youth who was selected would, at the utmost, be only 15 years old, and could not be supposed to have any very deeply rooted national prejudices. He should be sent to Madrid without French attendance, should be educated by Spaniards, should become a Spaniard. It was absurd to imagine that such a prince would be a mere viceroy of France. Apprehensions had been sometimes hinted that a Bourbon, seated on the throne of Spain, might cede his dominions in the Netherlands to the head of his family. It was undoubtedly important to England, and all important to Holland, that those provinces should not become a part of the French monarchy. All danger might be averted by making them over to the Elector of Bavaria, who was now governing them as representative of the Catholic king. The Dauphin would be perfectly willing to renounce them for himself and for all his descendants. As to what concerned trade, England and Holland had only to say what they desired, and everything in reason should be done to give them satisfaction. As this plan was, in the main, the same which had been suggested by the French ministers in the former conference, Portland did little more than repeat what he had then said. As to the new scheme respecting the Netherlands, he shrewdly propounded a dilemma which silenced Pomponne and Torcy. If renunciations were of any value, the Dauphin and his posterity were excluded from the Spanish succession, and if renunciations were of no value, it was idle to offer England and Holland a renunciation as a guarantee against a great danger. The French ministers withdrew to make their report to their master, and soon returned to say that their proposals had been merely first thoughts, that it was now the turn of King William to suggest something, and that whatever he might suggest should receive the fullest and fairest consideration. And now the scene of the negotiation was shifted from Versailles to Kensington. The Count of Tallard had just set out for England as ambassador. He was a fine gentleman, he was a brave soldier, and he was as yet reputed a skilful general. In all the arts and graces which were priced as qualifications for diplomatic missions of the highest class, he had, among the brilliant aristocracy to which he belonged, no superior and only one equal, the Marquess of Harcourt, who was entrusted with the care of the interests of the House of Bourbon at Madrid. Tallard carried with him instructions carefully framed in the French Foreign Office. He was reminded that his situation would be widely different from that of his predecessors who had resided in England before the Revolution. Even his predecessors, however, had considered it as their duty to study the temper not only of the court, but of the nation. It would now be more than ever necessary to watch the movements of the public mind. A man of note was not to be slighted merely because he was out of place. Such a man, with a great name in the country and a strong following in Parliament, might exercise as much influence on the politics of England, and consequently of Europe, as any minister. The ambassador must therefore try to be on good terms with those who were out as well as those who were in. To this rule, however, there was one exception which he must constantly bear in mind. With nonjurors and persons suspected of plotting against the existing government, he must not appear to have any connection. They must not be admitted into his house. The English people evidently wished to be at rest, and had given the best proof of their pacific disposition by insisting on the reduction of the army. The sure way to stir up jealousies and animosities, which were just sinking to sleep, would be to make the French embassy the headquarters of the Jacobite party. It would be wise in Tallard to say, and to charge his agents to say, on all fit occasions, and particularly in societies where members of Parliament might be present, that the most Christian king had never been an enemy of the liberties of England. His Majesty had indeed hoped that it might be in his power to restore his cousin, but not without the assent of the nation. In the original draft of the instructions was a curious paragraph which, on second thoughts, it was determined to omit. The ambassador was directed to take proper opportunities of cautioning the English against a standing army, as the only thing which could really be fatal to their laws and liberties. This passage was suppressed, no doubt, because it occurred to Pomponne and Torcy that, with whatever approbation the English might listen to such language when uttered by a demagogue of their own race, they might be very differently affected by hearing it from a French diplomatist, and might think that there could not be a better reason for arming than that Lewis and his emissaries earnestly wished them to disarm. Tallard was instructed to gain, if possible, some members of the House of Commons. Everything, he was told, was now subjected to the scrutiny of that assembly. Accounts of the public income, of the public expenditure, of the army, of the navy, were regularly laid on the table, and it would not be difficult to find persons who would supply the French legation with copious information on all these subjects. The question of the Spanish succession was to be mentioned to William at a private audience. Tallard was fully informed of all that had passed in the conferences which the French ministers had held with Portland, and was furnished with all the arguments that the ingenuity of publicists could devise in favour of the claim of the Dauphin. The French embassy made as magnificent an appearance in England as the English embassy had made in France. The mansion of the Duke of Ormond, one of the finest houses in St. James Square, was taken for Tallard. On the day of the public entry, all the streets from Tower Hill to Pall Mall were crowded with gazers who admired the painting and gilding of His Excellency's carriages, the surpassing beauty of his horses, and the multitude of his running footmen, dressed in gorgeous liveries of scarlet and gold lace. The ambassador was graciously received at Kensington, and was invited to accompany William to Newmarket, where the largest and most splendid spring meeting ever known was about to assemble. The attraction must be supposed to have been great, for the risks of the journey were not trifling. The peace had, all over Europe, and nowhere more than in England, turned crowds of old soldiers into marauders. Several aristocratical equipages had been attacked even in Hyde Park. Every newspaper contained stories of travellers stripped, bound, and flung into ditches. One day the Bristol mail was robbed, another day the Dover coach, then the Norwich waggon. On Hounslow Heath, a company of horsemen, with masks on their faces, waited for the great people who had been to pay their court to the king at Windsor. Lord Ossulston escaped with the loss of 2 horses. The Duke of St. Albans, with the help of his servants, beat off the assailants. His brother, the Duke of Northumberland, less strongly guarded, fell into their hands. They succeeded in stopping 30 or 40 coaches, and rode off with a great booty in guineas, watches, and jewellery. Nowhere, however, does the peal seem to have been so great as on the Newmarket road. There, indeed, robbery was organised on a scale unparalleled in the kingdom since the days of Robin Hood and Little John. A fraternity of plunderers, 30 in number according to the lowest estimate, squatted near Waltham Cross, under the shades of Epping Forest, and built themselves huts, from which they sallied forth with sword and pistol to bid passengers stand. The king and Tallard were doubtless too well attended to be in jeopardy, but soon after they had passed the dangerous spot, there was a fight on the highway attended with the loss of life. A warrant of the Lord Chief Justice broke up the maroon village for a short time, but the dispersed thieves soon mustered again, and had the impudence to bid defiance to the government in a cartel signed, it was said, with their real names. The civil power was unable to deal with this frightful evil. It was necessary that, during some time, cavalry should patrol every evening on the roads near the boundary between Middlesex and Essex. The state of those roads, however, though contemporaries described it as dangerous beyond all example, did not deter men of rank and fashion from making the joyous pilgrimages to Newmarket. Half the dukes in the kingdom were there. Most of the chief ministers of state swelled the crowd, nor was the opposition unrepresented. Montague stole 2 or 3 days from the Treasury, and Orford from the Admiralty. Godolphin was there, looking after his horses and his bets, and probably went away a richer man than he came. But racing was only one of the many amusements of that festive season. On fine mornings there was hunting. For those who preferred hawking, choice falcons had been brought from Holland. On rainy days the cockpit was encircled by stars and blue ribbons. On Sundays William went to church in state, and the most eminent divines of the neighbouring University of Cambridge preached before him. He omitted no opportunity of showing marked civility to Tallard. The ambassador informed his court that his place at table was next to the royal armchair, and that his health had been most graciously drunk by the king. All this time, both at Kensington and Newmarket, the Spanish question was the subject of constant and earnest discussion. To trace all the windings of the negotiation would be tedious. The general course which it took may easily be described. The object of William was to place the Electoral Prince of Bavaria on the Spanish throne. To obtain the consent of Louis to such an arrangement seemed all but impossible, but William manoeuvred with rare skill. Though he frankly acknowledged that he preferred the Electoral Prince to any other candidate, he professed himself desirous to meet, as far as he honourably or safely could, the wishes of the French king. There were conditions on which England and Holland might perhaps consent, though not without reluctance, that a son of the Dauphin should reign at Madrid, and should be master of the treasures of the New World. These conditions were that the Milanese and the 2 Sicilies should belong to the Archduke Charles, that the Elector of Bavaria should have the Spanish Netherlands, that Lewis should give up some fortified towns in Artois for the purpose of strengthening the barrier which protected the United Provinces, and that some important places, both in the Mediterranean Sea and in the Gulf of Mexico, should be made over to the English and Dutch for the security of trade. Minorca and Havana were mentioned as what might satisfy England. End of section 11. Recording by Jen Raimundo.
Of Chapter 23 of A History of England. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carmen H. History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay. Chapter 23, Section 12. Against these terms Lewis exclaimed loudly. Nobody, he said, who knew with how sensitive a jealousy the Spaniards watched every encroachment on their colonial empire, would believe that they would ever consent to give up any part of their empire either to England or to Holland. The demand which was made upon himself was altogether inadmissible. A barrier was not less necessary to France than to Holland, and he never would break the iron chain of frontier fastnesses which was the defence of his own kingdom, even in order to purchase another kingdom for his grandson. On that subject he begged that he might hear no more. The proposition was one which he would not discuss, one to which he would not listen. As William, however, resolutely maintained that the terms which he had offered, hard as they might seem, were the only terms on which England and Holland could suffer a Bourbon to reign at Madrid, Louis began seriously to consider whether it might not be on the whole for his interest and that of his family rather to sell the Spanish crown dear than to buy it dear. He therefore now offered to withdraw his opposition to the Bavarian claim, provided a portion of the disputed inheritance were assigned to him in consideration of his disinterestedness and moderation. William was perfectly willing and even eager to treat on this basis. The first demands of Louis were, as might have been expected, exorbitantly high. He asked for the kingdom of Navarre, which would have made him little less than master of the whole Iberian Peninsula, and for the Duchy of Luxembourg, which would have made him more dangerous than ever to the United Provinces. On both points he encountered a steady resistance. The impression which, throughout these transactions, the firmness and good faith of William made on Tallard is remarkable. At first the dexterous and keen-witted Frenchman was all suspicion. He imagined that there was an evasion in every phrase, a hidden snare in every offer. But after a time he began to discover that he had to do with a man far too wise to be false. The King of England, he wrote, and it is impossible to doubt that he wrote what he thought, acts with good faith in everything. His way of dealing is upright and sincere. The King of England, he wrote a few days later, has hitherto acted with great sincerity, and I venture to say that, if he once enters into a treaty, he will steadily adhere to it. But in the same letter, the ambassador thought it necessary to hint to his master that the diplomatic chicanery which might be useful in other negotiations would be all thrown away here. I must venture to observe to your Majesty that the King of England is very sharp-sighted, that his judgment is sound, and that if we try to spin the negotiation out, he will very soon perceive that we are trifling with him. During some time, projects and counter-projects continued to pass and repass between Kensington and Versailles. Something was considered on both sides, and when the session of Parliament ended, there seemed to be a fair hopes of a settlement. And now the scene of the negotiation was again changed. Having been shifted from France to England, it was shifted from England to Holland. As soon as William had prorogued the Houses, he was impatient to be again in his native land. He felt all the glee of a schoolboy who is leaving harsh masters and quarrelsome comrades to pass the Christmas holidays at a happy home. That stern and composed face, which had been the same in the pursuit at Bourne and in the rout at London, and of which the keenest politicians had in vain tried to read the secrets, now wore an expression but too intelligible. The English were not a little provoked by seeing their king so happy. Hitherto his annual visits to the Continent had been not only pardoned but approved. It was necessary that he should be at the head of his army. If he had left his people, It had been in order to put his life in jeopardy for their independence, their liberty, and their religion. But they had hoped that, when peace had been restored, when no call of duty required him to cross the sea, he would generally, during the summer and autumn, reside in his fair palaces and parks on the banks of the Thames, or travel from country seat to country seat, and from cathedral town to cathedral town, making himself acquainted with every shire of his realm, and giving his hand to be kissed by multitudes of squires, clergymen, and other men who were not likely ever to see him unless he came among them. It now appeared that he was sick of the noble residences which had descended to him from ancient princes, that he was sick even of those mansions which the liberality of Parliament had enabled him to build and embellish according to his own taste, that he was sick of Windsor, of Richmond, and of Hampton, that he promised himself no enjoyment from a progress through those flourishing and populous countries which he had never seen, Yorkshire and Norfolk, Cheshire, Shropshire, and Worcestershire. While he was forced to be with us, he was weary of us, pining for his home, counting the hours to the prorogation. As soon as the passing of the last bill of supply had set him at liberty, he turned his back on his English subjects. He hastened to his seat in Guelders, where, during some months, he might be free from the annoyance of seeing English faces and hearing English words, and he would with difficulty tear himself away from his favourite spot when it became absolutely necessary that he should again ask for English money. Thus his subjects murmured, but, in spite of their murmurs, he set off in high spirits. It had been arranged that Tallard should speedily follow him, and that the discussion in which they had been engaged at Kensington should be resumed at Loo. And Seals, whose co-operation was indispensable, would be there. Portland, too, would lend his assistance. He had just returned. He had always considered his mission as an extraordinary mission, of which the object was to put the relations between the two great Western powers on a proper footing, after a long series of years during which England had been sometimes the enemy, but never the equal friend of France. His task had been well performed, and he now came back leaving behind him the reputation of an excellent minister, firm yet cautious as to substance, dignified yet conciliating in manner. His last audience at Versailles was unusually long, and no third person was present. Nothing could be more gracious than the language and demeanour of Louis. He condescended to trace a route for the embassy, and insisted that Portland should make a circuit for the purpose of inspecting some of the superb fortresses of the French Netherlands. At every one of those fortresses the governors and engineers had orders to pay every attention to the distinguished stranger. Salutes were everywhere fired to welcome him. A guard of honour was everywhere in attendance on him. He stopped during 3 days at Chantilly, and was entertained there by the Prince of Conde, with all that taste and magnificence for which Chantilly had long been renowned. There were boar hunts in the morning and concerts in the evening. Every gentleman of the legation had a gamekeeper specially assigned to him. The guests who in their own island were accustomed to give extravagant vails at every country house which they visited, learned with admiration that His Highness' servants were strictly forbidden to receive presents. At his luxurious table, by a refinement of politeness, choice cider from the orchards round the Malvern Hills made its appearance in company with the champagne and the burgundy. Portland was welcomed by his master with all the kindness of old times. But that kindness availed nothing, for Albemarle was still in the royal household, and appeared to have been, during the last few months, making progress in the royal favour. Portland was angry, and the more angry because he could not but perceive that his enemies enjoyed his anger, and that even his friends generally thought it unreasonable, nor did he take any pains to conceal his vexation. But he was the very opposite of the vulgar crowd of courtiers who fawn on the master while they betray him. He neither disguised his ill humour, nor suffered it to interfere with the discharge of his duties. He gave his prince sullen looks, short answers, and faithful and strenuous services. His first wish, he said, was to retire altogether from public life, but he was sensible that, having borne a chief part in negotiation on which the fate of Europe depended, he might be of use at Loo, and with devoted loyalty, though with a sore heart and a gloomy brow, he prepared to attend William thither. Before the king departed, he delegated his power to 9 Lords Justices. The public was well pleased to find that Sunderland was not among them. Two new names appeared in the list. That of Mortaigne could excite no surprise, but that of Marlborough awakened many recollections and gave occasion to many speculations. He had once enjoyed a large measure of royal favour. He had then been dismissed, disgraced, imprisoned. The Princess Anne, for refusing to discard his wife, had been turned out of the palace, and deprived of the honours which had often been enjoyed by persons less near to the throne. Ministers who were supposed to have great influence in the closet had vainly tried to overcome the dislike with which their master regarded the Churchills. It was not till he had been some time reconciled to his sister-in-law that he ceased to regard her two favourite servants as his enemies. So late as the year 1696 he had been heard to say, "If I had been a private gentleman, my Lord Marlborough and I must have measured swords." All these things were now, it seemed, forgotten. The Duke of Gloucester's household had just been arranged. As he was not yet 9 years old, and the civil list was burdened with a heavy debt, £15,000 was thought for the present a sufficient provision. The child's literary education was directed by Burnet, with the title of preceptor. Marlborough was appointed governor, and the London Gazette announced his appointment not with official dryness, but in the fervid language of panegyric. He was at the same time again sworn a member of the Privy Council, from which he had been expelled with ignominy, and he was honoured a few days later with a still higher mark of the King's confidence, a seat at the Board of Regency. Some persons imagined that they saw in this strange reconciliation a sign that the influence of Portland was on the wane, and that the influence of Albemarle was growing. For Marlborough had been many years at feud with Portland, and had even, a rare event indeed, been so much irritated as to speak of Portland in coarse and ungentlemanlike terms. With Albemarle, on the other hand, Marlborough had studiously ingratiated himself by all the arts which a mind singularly observant and sagacious could learn from a long experience in courts, and it is possible that Albemarle may have removed some difficulties. It is hardly necessary, however, to resort to the supposition for the purpose of explaining why so wise a man as William forced himself, after some delay, caused by very just and natural resentment, to act wisely. His opinion of Marlborough's character was probably unaltered, but he could not help perceiving that Marlborough's situation was widely different from what it had been a few years before. That very ambition, that very avarice, which had in former times impelled him to betray two masters, were now sufficient securities for his fidelity to the order of things which had been established by the Bill of Rights. If that order of things could be maintained inviolate, he could scarcely fail to be, in a few years, the greatest and wealthiest subject in Europe. His military and political talents might therefore now be used without any apprehension that they will be turned against the government which used them. It is to be remembered, too, that he derived his importance less from his military and political talents, great as they were, than from the dominion which, through the instrumentality of his wife, he exercised over the mind of the princess. While he was on good terms with the court, it was certain that she would lend no countenance to any cabal which might attack either the title or the prerogatives of her brother-in-law. Confident that from this quarter, a quarter once the darkest and most stormy in the whole political horizon, nothing but sunshine and calm was now to be expected, William set out cheerfully on his expedition to his native country. End of section 12. End of chapter 23 of the History of England by Thomas Babington Macaulay.